My name is Eleanor. I am 29 years old, and I work as an archival restorer for a prestigious metropolitan museum. My daily life consists of taking broken, forgotten, or neglected artifacts and meticulously reconstructing their history. In restoration, you learn a fundamental truth about preservation. Nothing is ever truly erased. A stolen painting leaves a faded square on the wallpaper. A missing gemstone leaves a precise, empty groove in the gold. The people who take things always believe they have wiped the slate clean, but they forget that absence has a shape of its own. I was 25 years old when I walked out of a freezing November rain and into a high-end, estate pawn shop in the city. I was looking for a vintage brass hinge for a museum project. I walked past the glass display cases, barely glancing at the velvet displays, until my eyes caught a flash of deep, unmistakable blue. I stopped. I stopped breathing entirely. Sitting under the harsh halogen lights, nestled between cheap diamond tennis bracelets, was a custom-cut Ceylon sapphire pendant surrounded by seed pearls, set in heavy rose gold. But it was not just any sapphire. I knew, without even asking the jeweler to open the case, that if I turned that pendant over, I would find a microscopic, deliberate scratch on the back of the clasp. A tiny crescent moon my grandfather had etched there 40 years ago. It was my mother's necklace. The necklace my stepmother swore had been stolen by a nameless burglar 7 years prior. Welcome back to Family Drama Files, where we tell quiet, true-to-life stories about grief, calculated betrayal, and the exact moment someone stops shrinking to accommodate the toxic people in their lives. If you have ever watched an opportunist try to erase the memory of someone you loved, and if you believe that true justice is a dish best served absolutely freezing cold, this story is for you. Drop a comment below to let me know where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. To understand the absolute, suffocating cruelty of what I found in that glass case, you have to understand the sacred nature of my mother's jewelry box, and the woman who decided to treat it like a personal ATM. My mother died of an aggressive illness when I was 15 years old. She was a vibrant, deeply sentimental woman who believed that objects carried the energy of the people who wore them. She did not have a massive, million-dollar collection of diamonds, but what she had was irreplaceable. Every piece of jewelry she owned marked a specific, beautiful milestone in her life. There was the sapphire pendant her father gave her on her wedding day. There was a thick, braided gold charm bracelet carrying tiny, custom-engraved charms for every country she and my father had visited. There was a pair of emerald stud earrings she bought with her very first paycheck as an architect. A month before she became too weak to speak, my mother asked my father to bring her heavy, mahogany jewelry box to the hospital room. She took my hand, placed it on the polished wood, and made my father promise. "These are for Eleanor," my mother whispered, her voice fragile but fiercely determined. "When she turns 18, they belong to her. Promise me you will keep them safe until she is old enough." My father wept. He kissed her hand. He promised. My father was a man who loved deeply, but he was fundamentally weak in the face of conflict. When my mother passed, the grief did not harden him, it hollowed him out. He became a shell of a man, wandering through our home like a ghost, completely incapable of making decisions. For 2 years, I was the one who cooked the meals, paid the utility bills, and kept the household running. I guarded the mahogany jewelry box, which sat on the highest shelf of my father's closet, like a sacred relic. And then, when I was 17, Vanessa arrived. Vanessa was a commercial real estate agent who handled the sale of one of my father's small warehouse properties. She was 40 years old, fiercely elegant, and completely ruthless. She recognized my father's vulnerability instantly. A grieving, wealthy, lonely widower is a prime target for a woman who views marriage as a financial acquisition strategy. Vanessa did not enter our lives, she audited them. She started coming over to help organize his paperwork. Then she was bringing over catered dinners. Within 8 months, she had moved her designer luggage into the master bedroom. Within 1 year, she and my father were married in a quick, quiet ceremony. From the moment Vanessa unpacked her bags, the psychological warfare began. She did not act like an evil stepmother from a fairy tale. She was much smarter than that. She played the role of the concerned, practical matriarch, systematically erasing my mother's footprint from the house under the guise of helping my father move on. First, my mother's photographs were quietly taken down and replaced with sterile abstract art. Then, my mother's favorite reading chair was donated to charity while I was at school, because Vanessa claimed the velvet fabric was attracting dust and aggravating my father's allergies. I fought her on every single erasure, but my father, desperate for the artificial peace Vanessa provided, always took her side. "Eleanor, please," he would sigh, looking at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. "Vanessa is just trying to make this house a home again. Do not be so resistant to change. We have to live in the present." I realized very quickly that my father had chosen his new comfort over my grief. I was an inconvenient reminder of the woman he had lost. So, I put my head down, focused entirely on my grades, and counted the days until I could leave for university. The week before I moved into my college dormitory, I turned 18. I went to my father's closet to retrieve my mother's mahogany jewelry box. I planned to pack it in my suitcase and take it with me. But when I reached the top shelf, my hand met empty space. The box was not there. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced my chest. I tore through the closet. I checked my father's dresser drawers. I checked the locked safe in the home office. It was gone. I ran downstairs. I found my father and Vanessa sitting at the marble kitchen island, drinking coffee and looking at a catalog for patio furniture. "Where is my mother's jewelry box?" I asked, my voice shaking so badly I could barely form the words. "I am 18 today. She said it was mine." My father's face went completely pale. He immediately looked at Vanessa, seeking his script. Vanessa placed her coffee mug on the marble counter with a slow, deliberate click. She looked at me with a perfectly crafted expression of tragic, theatrical sympathy. "Oh, Eleanor," Vanessa sighed, pressing a perfectly manicured hand to her chest. "We were going to wait to tell you until you were settled at school. We didn't want to upset you before your big move." "Tell me what?" I demanded, my hands curling into fists at my sides. "There was a break-in," Vanessa said smoothly, her eyes wide with manufactured sorrow. "3 weeks ago, while you were at your senior retreat and your father and I were out of town for the weekend. It was just awful. They broke through the back sunroom window. They took the television from the guest room, some cash from the desk, and they found the jewelry box." I stared at her. The air in the room felt incredibly thin. "A break-in? Did you call the police? Where is the police report?" "We didn't file one," my father mumbled, staring intently at the catalog, refusing to look at me. "Vanessa said it would just raise our insurance premiums, and the jewelry was not officially appraised anyway. It would not have brought the items back." It was a lie. It was such an obvious, insulting, poorly constructed lie that the sheer audacity of it left me completely speechless. "You did not file a police report," I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, hollow whisper. "Someone broke into this house, stole the only things I had left of my dead mother, and you did not call the police because of insurance premiums." "Eleanor, please," Vanessa said, her voice taking on a sharp, patronizing edge, dropping the sympathetic act entirely. "It is just material stuff. Your mother would want you to focus on your education, not on old necklaces. We have to move forward. You are being hysterical." I looked at my father. "Dad, look at me. Tell me the truth." My father closed his eyes. "Eleanor, please do not start a fight today. Vanessa is right. It is gone. I am sorry." I knew in that exact moment that my father was completely lost to me. He was a coward who would rather help his new wife cover up a theft than protect the sacred promise he made to his dying wife. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I turned around, walked up the stairs, packed my suitcases, and left for college a week early. I did not return for Thanksgiving. I did not return for the winter holidays. I stayed on campus, securing work-study jobs in the library, applying for academic grants, and building my life entirely from the ground up. I changed my major to history and archival restoration, finding profound comfort in the act of preserving the past, since my own past had been so ruthlessly stolen from me. For 7 years, I lived completely independent of them. I spoke to my father on brief, 10-minute phone calls on his birthdays. I never spoke to Vanessa. I assumed the jewelry was gone forever, melted down for scrap or scattered across the country in various pawn shops, funding whatever designer handbags or spa vacations Vanessa had desired at the time. Until that freezing November afternoon, 7 years later. I stood in the estate pawn shop, staring at the Ceylon sapphire pendant through the glass. I took a slow, steadying breath, suppressing the massive wave of grief that threatened to buckle my knees. I had to treat this like a museum acquisition. I had to remain entirely objective. I approached the counter. An older man with a jeweler's loop around his neck looked up from a ledger. "Excuse me," I said, pointing to the display case. The sapphire and seed pearl pendant. May I see it? The jeweler unlocked the glass case and placed the pendant on a black velvet tray. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up. It was heavy. It was cold. I turned it over, examining the back of the rose gold clasp. There it was, the tiny, microscopic crescent moon. This piece is quite unique, the jeweler said, noting my intense focus. Early 20th century. The setting is custom. We acquired it a few weeks ago. I looked up at him, my blood running cold. A few weeks ago? Yes, he replied casually. It was part of a larger estate collection. My mind raced. A few weeks ago. Not 7 years ago. If the jewelry had been stolen by a random burglar when I was 18, it would have been pawned immediately. Burglars do not hold onto highly identifiable, custom-made pieces for 7 years. Sir, I said, my voice completely steady, relying on the professional authority I used when dealing with antiquities smugglers in my museum work. This pendant belongs to my family. It was reported missing 7 years ago. I can provide photographic evidence of my mother wearing it, and I can identify the specific custom engravings on several other pieces that belong in the exact same set. Did the person who sold this to you bring in a heavy, braided gold charm bracelet or square-cut emerald stud earrings? The jeweler's eyes widened. As a licensed dealer, the absolute last thing he wanted was to be caught selling stolen property. The fines could ruin his business. He immediately pulled the velvet tray back slightly. I cannot disclose customer information, he said defensively. I am not asking for a name, I said calmly, leaning over the glass counter. I am asking if the rest of the collection is in your back safe. Because if it is, I am going to call the police right now and report this location for holding stolen goods. Or we can have a quiet conversation about how we can resolve this right now. The jeweler stared at me. He saw the absolute, unyielding certainty in my eyes. He sighed, rubbing his temples, and reached under the counter. He pulled out a heavy steel lockbox. He opened it. Sitting inside the lockbox was my mother's braided gold charm bracelet. Next to it were the emerald stud earrings. Next to that was her diamond anniversary band. Every single piece of my mother's jewelry was sitting in a pawn shop in the city, 7 years after it supposedly vanished. The woman who brought these in, the jeweler said quietly, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. She comes in once a month. She brings 1 or 2 pieces at a time. She insists on cash. She told me they were her late grandmother's. Once a month, I asked, a cold realization washing over me. Yes, the jeweler confirmed. She has been doing this for about 6 months. She seems desperate, always in a hurry, always looking over her shoulder. Vanessa, she had not sold the jewelry 7 years ago. She had stolen the mahogany box, hidden it in the house, and lied to my face. She had kept my mother's legacy locked away like a personal emergency fund. And now, 7 years later, something in her perfect, curated life had gone wrong. She needed cash, she needed it regularly, and she needed it off the books. Sir, I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out my museum credentials. I am an archival restorer. I deal with provenance and stolen antiquities for a living. I am going to make you an offer. I looked the man dead in the eye. I will buy this entire collection back from you today for exactly what you paid the woman who brought it in, plus a 10% inconvenience fee, I said. In exchange, you are going to give me the dates and times she came into this shop. And the next time she walks through your door to sell the rest of my mother's life, you are going to call me. The jeweler looked at my museum credentials, looked at the custom engraving on the sapphire pendant, and then looked at the cold, unyielding expression on my face. He was a businessman who operated in the gray areas of estate liquidation, but he was not stupid enough to invite a police investigation over a few $1,000s worth of vintage gold. He nodded slowly. I paid her $6,000 total for the lot over the last 4 visits, he said, tapping the steel lockbox. Plus your 10% fee, that is $6,600. I did not blink. I pulled out my phone, transferred the funds from my savings to my checking account, and handed him my debit card. It was a massive hit to my finances, but I would have emptied my retirement account if it meant getting my mother's legacy out of that display case. As the transaction processed, the jeweler pulled a heavy leather ledger from under the counter. He wrote down 4 dates on a piece of shop stationery and slid it across the glass. She usually comes in on the 2nd Tuesday of the month, the jeweler murmured, looking around his empty shop to ensure no one was listening. always around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She wears oversized sunglasses and pays for parking with cash. She is incredibly paranoid. I took the slip of paper. I took the small velvet bags containing my mother's sapphire pendant, the charm bracelet, the emerald studs, and the diamond band. I walked out of the pawn shop and back into the freezing November rain. When I got to my apartment, I sat at my dining table and laid the jewelry out on a clean microfiber cloth. I spent 2 hours meticulously cleaning the pieces, restoring their brilliance, running my fingers over the tiny charms my father had bought my mother in Paris, in Rome, in Tokyo. As I cleaned the jewelry, the cold shock of the discovery began to solidify into a sharp, crystalline focus. Vanessa had stolen the mahogany box 7 years ago. She had lied to my face, and my father had covered for her. But she had not sold the items then. She had hidden them. And now, for the past 6 months, she was systematically liquidating them for untraceable cash. Why? My father was a wealthy man. He owned multiple commercial properties, a thriving investment portfolio, and the massive estate they lived in. Vanessa had full access to his platinum credit cards and his checking accounts. If she wanted to buy a designer handbag or take a luxury vacation, she did not need to pawn stolen jewelry in the city. She could just swipe my father's card. People who have access to limitless, legitimate wealth do not pawn vintage jewelry for cash unless they are funding something they desperately need to hide from the primary account holder. I needed to know what Vanessa was buying. The next morning, I requested 3 weeks of personal leave from the museum. My director, knowing my impeccable work ethic, granted it without question. I began my audit. I did not have access to my father's bank accounts, but in the modern era, you do not always need bank statements to track someone's movements. You just need to know how to look at the digital footprint they leave behind. I started with public records. I checked the county property tax database. My father's commercial properties were all current. The mortgage on their primary residence was paid. There were no liens, no sudden bankruptcies, and no civil lawsuits filed against either of them. The official financial facade was perfectly intact. Next, I created a fake social media account and found Vanessa's profile. Vanessa's online presence was exactly as I remembered her. Curated, arrogant, and obsessed with status. She posted photos of catered charity dinners, expensive wine tastings, and weekend trips to boutique resorts with my father. But as I scrolled back through the last 6 months, the exact timeline of her visits to the pawn shop, I noticed a subtle shift. The photos of her and my father together became less frequent. Instead, she began posting vague, inspirational quotes about finding oneself, deserving passion, and new beginnings. More importantly, she started checking in at high-end restaurants in the same city where the pawn shop was located, on Tuesday afternoons. She was establishing a pattern. I needed to know who she was meeting. The following Tuesday, 2 weeks after I recovered the first batch of jewelry, I parked my car down the street from the estate pawn shop. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I sat in the driver's seat, wearing a dark coat and a beanie, holding a telephoto camera I used for documenting museum artifacts. At exactly 1:45, a sleek, black luxury SUV pulled up to the parking meter across the street. The driver's side door opened. Out stepped Vanessa. She looked exactly the same as she had 7 years ago, perhaps a bit thinner, her face pulled tight with expensive cosmetic procedures. She was wearing a beige cashmere coat, oversized designer sunglasses, and carrying a large leather tote bag. I watched through the camera lens as she checked her surroundings, her head darting left and right with the jerky, paranoid movements of a woman who knew she was committing a crime. She walked quickly across the street and pushed open the door to the pawn shop. I did not follow her inside. I waited. 15 minutes later, she emerged. She was no longer carrying the small velvet pouch I had seen in her hand when she went in. Instead, she was zipping her tote bag shut, her posture slightly more relaxed, the tension of the transaction complete. She got back into her SUV and pulled into traffic. I pulled out behind her. Following someone in a city is not like the movies. It is tedious, stressful, and requires keeping exactly 3 cars between you and your target. I followed Vanessa's black SUV for 20 minutes, winding through the downtown financial district, until she pulled into the underground parking garage of an ultra-luxury, high-rise condominium building. I parked on the street, walked into the lobby of the building, and pretended to look at my phone while I watched the elevator bank. A few minutes later, Vanessa walked through the garage access doors. She walked up to the concierge desk, completely bypassing the visitor sign-in sheet, and gave the security guard a familiar, brilliant smile. "Afternoon, Mrs. Sterling," the guard said, tipping his hat. "Afternoon, Marcus," Vanessa replied brightly. "Is he upstairs?" "Yes, ma'am. Unit 42B." Vanessa stepped into the private elevator and the doors closed. I walked out of the lobby, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. Unit 42B, I went back to my car, opened my laptop, and accessed the city's public property registry. I searched the address of the luxury condominium building and pulled the deed for Unit 42B. The unit had been purchased 8 months ago. The purchase price was $2,500,000, but it was not purchased by an individual. It was purchased by a blind limited liability company registered in a neighboring state. I spent the next 4 hours utilizing every investigative research tool I had learned in my archival training. I pulled the corporate registration for the limited liability company. I traced the registered agent to a boutique law firm. I dug through the law firm's public filings until I finally found a single, careless signature on an annual operating report. The signature belonged to a man named Julian Vance. I ran Julian Vance through every search engine and database I could access. Julian Vance was 32 years old. He was a personal trainer who catered exclusively to wealthy, middle-aged housewives in the affluent suburbs where my father lived. He had a history of massive credit card debt, 2 failed fitness studio businesses, and a heavily curated social media profile filled with shirtless photos and luxury cars. He clearly could not afford on a trainer's salary. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying, absolute clarity. Vanessa was having an affair, but she was not just sleeping with a younger man, she was funding his entire life. She had likely convinced my father to invest in Julian's new fitness venture, using the blind limited liability company to purchase the multi-million-dollar luxury condo as a corporate asset. But keeping a 32-year-old grifter happy requires constant, liquid cash. Julian Vance wanted expensive watches, tailored suits, and weekend trips. Vanessa could not use my father's credit cards for those purchases without raising massive red flags on the monthly statements. So she needed untraceable cash. And she found it sitting in a mahogany box on the highest shelf of my father's closet. My stepmother was selling my dead mother's legacy, piece by piece, to pay for her 20-something-year-old boy toy. The sheer, staggering disrespect of it made my blood run entirely cold. She had not only stolen my inheritance, she had desecrated my mother's memory to fund a cheap, vulgar affair. I closed my laptop. I did not cry. I did not scream. I felt a profound, absolute stillness settle over my mind. If I simply told my father about the affair, Vanessa would deny it. She would claim Julian Vance was just a business investment, a troubled young man she was mentoring. My father, desperate to maintain the illusion of his perfect second marriage, would believe her. If I told him about the pawn shop, she would claim I was lying, that I had stolen the jewelry myself to frame her. I needed a trap that offered absolutely no route of escape. I needed to expose the affair, the theft, and the financial fraud simultaneously, in front of an audience that would render my father's denial completely impossible. I looked at the calendar on my phone. In exactly 3 weeks, my father was hosting his annual holiday estate gala. It was a massive, catered event held at his house, attended by over 100 people, his business partners, local politicians, country club friends, and the elite social circle Vanessa had spent 7 years cultivating. It was the most important night of Vanessa's year. It was the perfect stage. Over the next 3 weeks, I executed the architecture of my revenge. First, I needed the rest of the jewelry. I called the estate jeweler. "She came in today," I told him over the phone. "What did she leave?" "A platinum tennis bracelet and 2 vintage brooches," the jeweler confirmed, sounding incredibly nervous. "I gave her $2,000 for them." "I will be there in 20 minutes, I said. "Have them boxed." I bought the pieces back. Over the next 3 weeks, I visited 5 other high-end pawn shops in the surrounding city area, bringing photographs of my mother's collection. I found 3 more shops where Vanessa had offloaded items. I bought back my mother's pearl choker, her gold watch, and her ruby cocktail ring. I drained my savings account completely, but I successfully recovered 90% of the stolen collection. Next, I needed to secure the undeniable proof of the affair. I hired a private investigator. I paid him a premium rush fee, handing him the address of the luxury condo and the name Julian Vance. I do not need a month of surveillance, I told the investigator, sliding an envelope of cash across the table at a diner. I just need high-definition, time-stamped photographs of Vanessa and Julian entering and exiting Unit 42B together. I need photos of them being physically affectionate in public spaces. And I need a complete background check on the limited liability company used to purchase that condo, linking the funds directly to my father's corporate accounts. The investigator nodded. Give me 10 days. He delivered the dossier in 8. The photographs were incredibly damning. There were high-definition shots of Vanessa and Julian kissing passionately in the underground parking garage. There were photos of them drinking champagne on the balcony of the luxury condo. The financial background check was even more devastating. The investigator had uncovered the wire transfers. My father's primary business account had wired $2,500,000 to the blind limited liability company, precisely 1 week before the condo was purchased. Vanessa had convinced my father to buy her lover a penthouse. I took the photographs, the financial documents, and the receipts from the 6 different pawn shops, and I compiled them into 50 sleek, black presentation folders. Then I went shopping. I bought a stunning, floor-length emerald green evening gown. I booked an appointment at a high-end salon to have my hair and makeup done. For 7 years, Vanessa had painted me as the bitter, estranged, ungrateful daughter who had abandoned the family. I needed to walk into that gala looking like an absolute powerhouse. I needed to look like a woman who could not be dismissed. The night of the holiday estate gala was bitterly cold, but the sky was perfectly clear. I hired a black town car to drive me to my father's house. I did not want to worry about parking. I wanted to arrive at the peak of the evening. As the car pulled up the long, circular driveway, I could see the massive house blazing with light. A string quartet was playing in the grand foyer. Valets were rushing to park luxury vehicles. I stepped out of the town car. I wore the emerald green gown, a faux fur wrap, and high heels. But my most important accessories were not visible immediately. Around my neck, I wore my mother's custom Ceylon sapphire pendant. On my right wrist, I wore her heavy, braided gold charm bracelet. On my left hand, her diamond anniversary band. And in my ears, her emerald studs. I was wearing the exact jewelry Vanessa had sworn was stolen by a burglar 7 years ago, the jewelry she had pawned for cash. I carried a sleek, black velvet clutch bag. Inside were 5 copies of the investigator's dossier. The other 45 copies were locked in the trunk of the town car, waiting for my signal. I walked up the grand stone steps and handed my coat to the attendant. I did not have an invitation, but the hired security guard at the door recognized me from old family photos. He looked surprised, but he stepped aside and opened the massive double doors. I walked into the grand foyer. The house was packed. Waiters carried silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The elite of the city stood in small clusters, laughing, adjusting their expensive tailoring. I did not immediately look for my father. I looked for the stage. In the center of the massive living room, a small, elevated platform had been erected for the string quartet and for the evening's speeches. Standing near the platform, holding a glass of champagne and laughing loudly at a joke told by the mayor, was Vanessa. She looked radiant. She was wearing a blood-red silk gown, her hair perfectly styled, playing the role of the ultimate, wealthy hostess. Standing next to her, looking older and incredibly tired, was my father. I took a deep breath, adjusting the sapphire pendant so it rested perfectly against my collarbone. I walked directly into the center of the room. I did not hurry. I moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator, walking into a trap it had built itself. The crowd naturally parted as I moved, drawn by the stark contrast of my emerald gown against the sea of black tuxedos. As I approached the center of the room, people began to notice me. Whispers broke out. "Is that Eleanor, Richard's daughter? I thought she was estranged." The whispers grew louder, traveling across the room like a wave until they reached the platform. My father turned his head. He saw me. His champagne flute stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes widened in absolute, staggering shock. Vanessa turned a second later. She saw me. She saw the emerald gown. She put on her immediate, fake, hostess smile, preparing to play the gracious stepmother welcoming the prodigal daughter home. "Eleanor," Vanessa projected her voice, ensuring the crowd heard her magnanimity. "What a wonderful surprise. You came home for the holidays." She took 2 steps toward me, her arms opening for a theatrical embrace. But then, the harsh, bright chandelier light caught the deep blue flash of the salon's sapphire resting on my chest. Vanessa stopped dead in her tracks. I watched her eyes drop from my face to my neck. I watched her recognize the pendant. I watched her eyes dart to my wrist, recognizing the heavy gold charm bracelet. I watched her look at my ears, seeing the emerald studs. In the span of 3 seconds, the radiant, confident hostess died. Her face drained of all color, turning a sickly, translucent white. Her jaw went completely slack. The champagne glass in her hand began to tremble violently, the liquid sloshing over the crystal rim and spilling onto her blood-red dress. She knew. She knew exactly what I was wearing, she knew exactly where I had found it, and she knew exactly what it meant. I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. "Hello, Vanessa," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room. "I love what you have done with the place. I just thought I would drop by to return a few things you misplaced." The silence in the grand living room was absolute. 100 of the city's elite socialites stood completely frozen, their champagne glasses suspended in midair. The string quartet had stopped playing. The only sound was the crackle of the massive stone fireplace and the sharp, ragged intake of Vanessa's breath. My father stepped out from behind his wife. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and hesitant joy at seeing his estranged daughter. But then, just like Vanessa, his gaze dropped to my chest. He saw the Ceylon sapphire. He saw the heavy gold charm bracelet. My father was a weak man, but he was not a blind one. He had bought that charm bracelet in Paris 30 years ago. He knew exactly what he was looking at. "Eleanor," my father whispered, his voice trembling, echoing off the high ceilings. That is your mother's jewelry. You found it. The police found the burglar." "There was no burglar, Dad," I said, stepping closer to the raised platform. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly at my sides. "There was no break-in 7 years ago. No one smashed the back window to steal the television and the mahogany box. It was a lie. A poorly constructed, convenient lie." "Eleanor, stop it," Vanessa shrieked. The panic finally overrode her paralysis. She lunged forward, her face twisting into a mask of ugly, desperate rage. "Richard, she is lying. She stole that jewelry herself when she left for college. She hid it for 7 years just to come back and humiliate us. Security, throw her out." 2 hired security guards in black suits began to move through the crowd, but my father raised a shaking hand. "Stop," my father commanded the guards. He turned his eyes back to me, his face pale. "Eleanor, what are you talking about? If there was no burglar, where has the jewelry been for 7 years? "It has been sitting right here in this house, Dad," I explained, my voice as steady and cold as a winter river. "Vanessa hid it. She kept it locked away as a personal emergency fund. And for the last 6 months, she has been systematically selling my mother's legacy, piece by piece, to 6 different pawn shops in the downtown financial district." A collective, synchronized gasp rolled through the crowd. The mayor's wife, standing just a few feet away, covered her mouth with her hand. "It is a lie," Vanessa screamed, tears of sheer panic ruining her expensive makeup. "She is insane. She is a bitter, jealous child." I did not raise my voice. I simply opened my sleek, black velvet clutch. I pulled out a stack of pristine, stamped receipts from the estate jewelers. I dropped them onto the floor at Vanessa's feet. "Those are the buyback receipts, Vanessa," I said smoothly. "Complete with the dates, the times, and the descriptions of the items you sold for untraceable cash. The jewelers have you on their security cameras. You went in on the 2nd Tuesday of every month." My father looked at the receipts scattered on the hardwood floor. He looked at Vanessa, who was trembling so violently she looked like she might collapse. "Vanessa," my father asked, his voice cracking. "Why, you have my credit cards. You have unlimited access to the checking accounts. If you wanted cash, why would you steal from Eleanor? Why would you pawn my dead wife's jewelry?" "Because, Dad," I answered for her, stepping up onto the edge of the platform, "people only need untraceable cash when they are funding something they cannot put on a shared credit card." I reached into my velvet clutch one more time. I pulled out the 5 black presentation folders. I handed the first folder directly to my father. I handed the second folder to the mayor. I handed the third and fourth to my father's 2 primary business partners, who were standing entirely dumbfounded in the front row. I kept the 5th folder for myself. Vanessa needed untraceable cash to buy expensive suits, tailored shirts, and luxury watches for her 32-year-old personal trainer, Julian Vance, I announced to the room. Vanessa let out a horrific guttural wail. She tried to snatch the folder out of my father's hands, but he yanked it away from her, his eyes locked on the cover. "If you open the folder, Dad," I instructed, adopting the calm, authoritative tone I used when presenting archival research to the museum board, "you will find high-definition, time-stamped photographs of your wife and Mr. Vance kissing in the underground parking garage of a luxury condominium building. You will also find photos of them drinking champagne on the balcony of Unit 42B. My father opened the folder. The color drained from his face entirely. He stared at the glossy 8x10 photographs, his hands shaking so violently the pages rustled. But the pawn shop cash was only for Julian's pocket money, I continued, pacing slowly across the platform, addressing the entire room of silent, captivated socialites. The real theft was much larger, because a 32-year-old grifter does not stay with a married woman just for pocket money. He wants real estate. I looked at my father's business partners, who were already flipping through the financial documents in their folders. "Check the 4th page," I told them. 8 months ago, a blind limited liability company registered in a neighboring state purchased Unit 42B for exactly $2,500,000, I explained. If you trace the corporate registration, the sole managing member of that company is Julian Vance. And if you trace the wire transfer that funded the purchase, it came directly from your primary commercial operating account, Dad. Vanessa convinced you to wire $2,500,000 to a shell company, claiming it was a new commercial real estate investment. She used your money to buy her lover a penthouse. "Oh my God," one of the business partners breathed, staring at the banking records. He looked up at Vanessa with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You embezzled from the firm." My father dropped the folder. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. He looked at the woman he had chosen over me, the woman he had allowed to erase my mother from our home, the woman he had defended when my inheritance was stolen. Vanessa was trapped. There were no more lies to spin. The photographs were undeniable. The financial records were legally binding. She was standing in front of 100 of the most powerful people in the city, entirely exposed as a thief, an embezzler, and an adulterer. "Richard, please," Vanessa sobbed, reaching out to grab his tuxedo jacket. "It meant nothing. He was just a mistake. I love you. She set me up, Richard, please." My father looked at her hands on his jacket. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a 10-year coma. "Get your hands off me," my father whispered. His voice was not angry, it was entirely, devastatingly hollow. He stepped back, turning his face away from her. I looked toward the grand foyer and caught the eye of the security guard. I gave him a single, sharp nod. The front doors opened. My hired town car driver walked in, pushing a polished brass luggage cart. Stacked neatly on the cart were 45 more black presentation folders. I looked out at the crowd of gossiping, staring socialites. Vanessa had spent 7 years cultivating these people, desperate for their approval, desperate to be the queen of this social circle. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice perfectly polite, dismissing Vanessa completely. "I know this is not the entertainment you expected this evening, but since my stepmother went to such great lengths to curate this event, I felt it was only right to provide party favors. Please take a folder on your way out, read the documents, and understand exactly who has been pouring your champagne." The room erupted into whispers. A few brave guests actually stepped forward to grab a folder from the cart. I did not stay to watch the rest of the party dismantle itself. I had accomplished exactly what I came to do. I had restored the historical record. I turned my back on the platform. I walked through the parted crowd, my emerald gown sweeping across the hardwood floors. My mother's sapphire rested heavily and beautifully against my chest. I walked out the front doors, stepped into the waiting town car, and drove back to the city. The aftermath of the Holiday Estate Gala was a masterclass in catastrophic ruin. In archival restoration, when a fraudulent artifact is exposed, it is not simply removed from the display case. Its entire history is discredited. Vanessa's life was discredited overnight. The guests who took the dossiers did exactly what I knew they would do. They talked. Within 48 hours, every country club, every charity board, and every high-end salon in the city knew exactly what Vanessa had done. She became an absolute social pariah. People crossed the street to avoid her. She was expelled from the museum's benefactor board. But the social ruin was nothing compared to the legal demolition. My father's business partners, terrified by the $2,500,000 embezzlement from their operating accounts, immediately froze all corporate assets and initiated a forensic audit of their own. They filed a massive civil lawsuit against Vanessa and Julian Vance for fraud and grand larceny. My father filed for divorce the very next morning, because Vanessa had committed documented financial fraud to funnel marital assets to a paramour. The standard divorce laws were entirely subverted. The judge in the divorce proceedings was ruthless. Vanessa was stripped of any claim to alimony. She was ordered to pay back the $2,500,000 plus the value of the pawned jewelry, which left her completely bankrupt. As for Julian Vance, the moment the money dried up and the civil lawsuits were filed, he abandoned her. He attempted to sell the luxury condo and flee the state, but the business partners had already placed a legal freeze on the property. Julian was left with nothing but mounting legal fees and a ruined reputation. Vanessa moved out of my father's estate with nothing but 2 suitcases. Last I heard, she was living in a cheap rental apartment in a neighboring state, working a commission-only sales job, entirely stripped of the wealth and status she had destroyed her family to attain. A few months after the gala, my father asked to meet me at a quiet coffee shop in the city. He looked 10 years older. He had lost weight, and his hands shook slightly when he held his coffee cup. He looked at the sapphire pendant around my neck, and tears filled his eyes. "Eleanor," my father said, his voice thick with regret. "I am so sorry. I was blind. I was so afraid of being alone after your mother died that I let a monster into our home. I let her push you away. I should have called the police the day that mahogany box went missing. Can you ever forgive me?" I looked at the man sitting across from me. "I loved my father, but I am an archival restorer. I know that you cannot simply glue a shattered vase back together and pretend the cracks are not there. A broken foundation must be acknowledged." "I forgive you, Dad," I said quietly. "But forgiveness does not mean amnesia. You chose your comfort over my grief. You chose her lies over my truth. I am glad you are finally free of her, but I spent 7 years building a life without you, and I like the life I built." My father wept quietly into his napkin, understanding the boundary I had just set. We agreed to speak on holidays, to maintain a polite distance, but he knew the profound, unbreakable bond we once shared was gone. He had traded it away for a comfortable lie. I walked out of the coffee shop and back to my museum. People who hear this story often ask me how I managed to keep my composure in the pawn shop. They ask how I didn't break down sobbing when I finally held my mother's jewelry again. I tell them the same thing I tell my junior archivists. When you uncover a stolen piece of history, crying does not secure the artifact. Emotion does not correct the record. The only thing that restores the truth is cold, meticulous documentation, and an absolute refusal to let the thieves write the final chapter. Vanessa thought she could erase my mother by selling her legacy to a pawn shop. She thought she could erase me by painting me as a bitter, estranged child. But she underestimated the patience of a woman who reconstructs shattered histories for a living. I did not let her keep my mother's jewelry, and I did not let her keep my father's wealth. I took back every single piece of the past she tried to steal, and I wore it as armor while I burned her fraudulent life to the ground. That is my story. If you are listening to this, and you are dealing with an opportunist who tries to erase your history, who gaslights your grief, or who relies on your silence to fund their lies, do not scream. Do not argue with them. Just start digging. Find the receipts. Trace the funds. Buy back your piece by piece, and wait for the perfect moment to return the party favors. If you have ever had to reclaim your own history, or if you believe in the absolute, undeniable power of a well-timed document drop, type the word "restored" in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you for tuning in to Family Drama Files. Remember, your history is not negotiable, and your peace is a premium asset. Protect it fiercely. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one.